Hi. Continue our discussion of animation. We're going to talk now about property animation. With property animation, we can animate anything we want. We can change the value of any property in any object, regardless of whether that object or that property is visible at all. We can animate anything we want to, even if it doesn't make sense to animate something. The base class for property animation is Value Animator, but we seldom use Value Animator. It's very powerful, but it animates using key value pairs, and it's quite difficult to use Value Animator. It results in quite a bit of code to actually use Value Animator. Luckily, we have a subclass of Value Animator provided by Android called Object Animator that makes property animation extremely simple. So that's what we're going to use. Object Animator is extremely powerful. It has factory methods that give you back an object animator of a specific type. And these factory methods are named of and then the type name. So we have of float, of int, and so forth. They return an animator that applies to the property of the type that the factory method names. So if the property that we're animating is a floating point value, then we would use of float. If it's an integer value, we would use of int, and so forth. So here's an example. We have an object animator dot of float is the factory method, and then it takes 4 parameters. This one, just the first parameter is the name of the object that we're going to animate. The second parameter is a string naming the property that we're going to animate of that object. The third parameter is the beginning value, and the fourth parameter is the ending value. So what we have here is we're going to animate an object named TV, and we're going to take its rotation through 180 degrees, starting at 0 degrees and going to 180. And what we have to have is a setter called set rotation in order for this to work. So once we have the animator, we can set a duration. So let's say that the animator we just instantiated was called MyAnimator. If we say MyAnimator.duration 500, that means half a second is going to take for that animation to run. And then we can run the animation very simply by just saying MyAnimator.start. The property we animate, as I already said, has to have a setter. So if we're setting rotation, if we're animating rotation, then we have to have a setter named set rotation. Normally what we're animating in property animation is viewable objects. We're usually animating controls of some kind, and the setters already exist, either in the control itself or in its superclass, which is view. If we need to get something out of that animation, maybe to save it for the next animation, then it needs to have a getter as well. We can schedule property animation. There are ways to set up multiple animations and then tell them to run before, run after this animation or that animation, and we don't have to do that whole offset thing that we do with view animation. So property animation is extremely powerful, and the question always arises, why don't I just use property animation all the time? Well, there's kind of a trade-off. If we can get away with view-based animation, we should always use view-based animation. As view-based animation becomes more complex, let's say, or impossible because it doesn't retain the properties, then we need to use property animation. Simple property animation is always much simpler than view-based animation. But complex property animation can be a great deal more complicated to do than a similar view-based animation would be. So there's a trade-off. And then also, I believe property animation is only available from about API 8, about 8 or 9, well, the 9 doesn't exist anymore, it was deprecated, but 8 or 10 maybe. So very old Android devices won't have the capability to do property-based animation, but they will have the capability to do, there's always the capability to do view-based animation. Okay, if you haven't already, look at the property animation demo, and this will clearly explain quite a bit about property animation, and certainly enough to get you started with this very powerful and important animation tool. Thank you.